Targeting can be done in a couple of different ways. It can be done spiritually or it can be done physically. The spiritual type of targeting is the most common. However, I'd be lying if I said that it didn't happen physically from time to time. Guys, I want to speak about two men who were both researching extraterrestrials when they became targets. One of them was targeted by human beings, and the other was targeted by interdimensional beings. As one might expect, both of these accounts are loaded with information, so there's no way I can cover both of them in just one video. So my plan is to speak about one of the targets in this video and the other target in my next video. This is the first gentleman. His name was Paul Bennewitz, and it's a documented fact that this man was targeted by human beings. In 1969, while pursuing his PhD in physics, Paul Bennewitz started a successful electronics company in New Mexico called Thunder Scientific. His primary clients were the Air Force and NASA. One important fact that I must mention before I delve deeper into the Paul Bennewitz account is that none of the people closest to Paul knew that he was being targeted, not his family and not his friends. It's very important to keep that in mind as I explain what happened. The only ones who knew were the ones who were actually doing the targeting. Now, Paul did so much business with the US military that he actually bought a home and established a lab right next to the Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, one of the largest Air Force installations in the country. Now, Paul would often see strange colored lights in the sky around the Air Force Base, which he initially assumed were experimental aircraft, but then he realized they were moving too fast to be aircraft. Paul, who was a pilot and a military contractor, was in possession of some very high-tech tracking equipment, and he began to pick up strange radio signals that seemed to be in the form of some kind of extraterrestrial language. In addition to this, Paul was an engineer, a physicist, and an expert in electronics. So using his know-how, he was able to analyze and decode the messages. And what he learned was that the messages were very alarming. Once again, I have to take a moment to mention some important facts that must be kept in mind before I proceed with this video. Most of the information and data that Paul Bennewitz received regarding aliens or extraterrestrials, if you prefer, were all fabricated. Folks, it was all a lie. These things were all part of a disinformation campaign perpetrated by the US government using two government-paid disinformation agents, one by the name of Richard Doty and the other Bill Moore, who both admitted to misleading Paul Bennewitz while working for the AFOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. This campaign was not only meant to deceive and manipulate Paul, but also to infiltrate the entire UFO community in order to fill it with as much disinformation as possible. Now, let us continue. While Paul was decoding the fake extraterrestrial messages that were coming from the United States Air Force, but of course at the time he didn't know they were fake, he thought they were authentic, Paul learned that the aliens' home world was dying and that there were multiple alien races right here on Earth, some of which resembled humans. Using these messages, the Air Force was able to convince Paul that an alien invasion of the Earth would happen very soon. Paul, thinking that this was true, felt that the people of the Earth needed to be warned. So he gathered all of his information and took his findings to none other than the United States Air Force. But of course, they already had the information because they were the ones sending it to Paul. The Air Force, pretending that this was the first time they were hearing this information, acted shocked and congratulated Paul. They even offered to fund Paul's research as long as he would bring all of his findings directly to them, and Paul agreed. One major red flag that Paul missed is that even though they were funding Paul's extraterrestrial research, publicly the Air Force would deny anything about UFOs and the alien story, but privately they would confirm and acknowledge Paul's findings. That should have set off some alarm bells for Paul. Now I want to highlight some of the tactics that were used by the Air Force to manipulate Paul Bennewitz. Keep in mind that their manipulation and trickery eventually turned into covert harassment. This is Richard Doty, former Air Force intelligence operative, one of the people used to deceive and manipulate Paul Bennewitz, which ultimately drove Bennewitz insane. Bennewitz was told by Doty that the strange radio signals that he was picking up were of alien origin. He also told Bennewitz to continue to monitor those signals because the U.S. military believed that we were going to have an alien invasion, even though Doty knew that those signals were coming from the U.S. Air Force. Bennewitz was also tricked into believing that there was once a relationship between the U.S. government and the aliens, but that relationship went sour. Another lie that the Air Force told Paul was that the aliens have abducted at least 300,000 Americans who have all been implanted with devices which turn these people into walking cameras and microphones, and then they were returned back to the general public. They also told Paul that horrific genetic experiments like splicing alien DNA with humans were being performed. Doty and the Air Force would take Paul out and stage events for him. They would place machinery and fake props all around the Archuleta Mesa for him to photograph. They even went as far as putting what looked like fake alien aircraft in the same area. The OSI had helicopters painted black and would fly them at times and locations where Paul was sure to see them, and Paul had no idea that it was all staged. Now I need to mention this. Just because the government ran this disinformation campaign regarding extraterrestrials against Paul Bennewitz, it doesn't mean that extraterrestrials don't exist. But in order for a person to see how they are indeed very possible, you need to understand dimensions and interdimensional beings, which I'll speak more about in coming videos. In all honesty, what the United States government did to Paul Bennewitz was extremely wicked. Paul became very paranoid and didn't trust anyone around him. At one point, he even thought that his wife had an alien implant. Paul kept weapons all over his house, any weapons he can get his hands on, knives, guns, whatever. And he insisted that he was being watched and followed all the time. That should sound familiar to many targets. One day, Paul barricaded himself in his house, covering every door and window with sandbags. Paul's mental health continued to decline. He was smoking several packs of cigarettes a day, and he had lost an excessive amount of weight. Now here's the part that makes me wonder if there was maybe some spiritual element to this account, but I can't say for sure. Paul said that aliens were coming into his room at night and injecting him with something that was making him drive out into the desert and return back home with no recollection of how he got there. Both Richard Doty and Bill Moore confirmed that they saw the needle marks on Paul's arms. The question is, how did they get there? Now, I can't speculate that there was anything spiritual going on here, simply because the United States government admitted that this man was a target and they were covertly harassing him. Eventually, Paul's family committed him to a psychiatric facility, and he sadly passed away in that mental state in 2003 at the age of 75. As always, thanks for watching, guys, and God bless.